Hey, I'm Rich. I'm a software developer at Webinar Geek. And at Webinar Geek, as well as in basically any other company that I've worked for, we often say things like, "Oh, this is really magic," or "This is Rails magic." And I imagine since you are doing this bootcamp, you have probably a similar situation where you do a lot of this. So, what I wanted to talk about today and maybe debunk a little bit is basically this notion of magic, and I wanted to see like where does it come from, and is it like really magic, and how to deal with this, how to become a magician. And if we dig a little bit deeper, or at the very beginning of the whole thing, of the whole Ruby and Rails magic thing, then we will see there that at the very beginning there is Ruby, the language, which is written with characters in the language C, and it's a server-side language. Parts of it are still written also, not still, but they are written in Ruby itself. And I don't know of any like witchers or like other or witches who would go around the language and keep it alive or something. I haven't seen that. But I also know that it's a very popular language. So if you, I think you're really lucky to be kind of in this bootcamp, in this Ruby and Rails bootcamp, because a lot of companies are really looking for people right now, including us, by the way. So if after the bootcamp you're interested, just ping me and show me your projects. Let's have a tea or something, and then we'll figure something out. And there's also this Rails thing, right? Which is a lot. It's always said that there's a lot of magic going on. It's like people who try to find, for example, in job interviews, you will be asked what you don't like about Rails. And so one answer might be that in Rails so many things happen under the hood, and without like explicitly configuring things, or without explicitly writing code for something. And I don't think it would be a good answer. A good answer might be an extension of that, where you could say it's sometimes difficult to override Rails defaults, and Rails is very opinionated. So you can note down this one. Um, but Rails, it's a backend framework, and it's written in Ruby, obviously, and it's also very popular. Although I think more people will find reasons to hate Rails than Ruby. Ruby is really a good person thing in this world. And there is this Rails magic thing, right? Um, I really can imagine how you feel right now doing this bootcamp and just starting out with Rails, because 2 years ago, after already some years in professional software teams, I started to also learn Rails and Ruby. And it was quite frustrating at times, because there are a lot of situations where you are like, why is this happening? Or you do something here and then something is moving there, and then there is an error here, and you are like, I don't know. Let's start a new project because at this point it doesn't make any sense anymore. So it's good in Rails to start a lot of small projects. It's a good learning technique, I think. So there's a lot of things going on there, right? And most of it is, or I don't know if it's most of it, but a lot of it is Rails conventions. So Rails has this thing of saying we prefer convention over configuration. And what it basically means is things just happen with Rails code without you explicitly needing to code anything. And you will see this a lot when you start a new project, right? You do your Rails new something, your awesome app, and you do maybe generate a scaffold. And with those scaffolds, they generate a lot of files, and then I'm still a little bit overwhelmed when I see all those files. I don't know, like, still, I don't know what they're for, or all of them. Or I haven't dug deeper, actually. Probably I would understand it quickly, but I just don't need many of them. So when you use a scaffold, you can avoid using a scaffold when you write just things yourself, or you use it, but then delete the things that you don't need. And when you just run this scaffold thing and this new project thing, you already have so many folders, right? So much code. And you basically have a running application, right? So one convention, for example, or one example of these convention thingies is the test folder. The test folder contains so many folders already for you. And Rails is basically saying, this is the things you need to test. And I really hope all of you will test a lot. And Rails says test your controllers, your integrations, your models. And in the new version of Rails, there will be other folders, or those conventions also change over time, which makes things also more complicated sometimes, right? And you just need to be aware of this and go with the current flow. Always be aware of your current Rails version and the tutorials or the Stack Overflow answers you're looking for. If they are for a different version, things may have changed. And of course, there's like routes that create resources, named bootcamps, because we ran the scaffold bootcamp things. Does anyone know why it's called resources? Yeah, it's difficult to know why. And it's kind of magic as well, right? If you haven't dug that deep to ask yourself and Google the question, like, why is it resources, then you might not know it. And apart from being an MVC framework, this is something we'll talk about a little bit in a few minutes later. It's also, like, many years ago, the creators of Rails said Rails will also be trying to follow the RESTful style. And the RESTful style is a style of creating APIs, which are very important nowadays. And APIs usually have this terminology of resources. So what you're doing with APIs, you are managing resources, basically, in its essence. And this is why Rails has this thing of saying, when you we offer you this helper here, the resources helper, and you will have all these actions and all these views. You already will have everything, and you will have a RESTful I don't know if it's 100% RESTful, but REST style API at your hand. And this also means that you have all these actions in the controllers, right? But now you probably know why they are there, because they're trying to follow a certain style, a certain framework, or even multiple frameworks at a time. REST, MVC, whatever else, we'll see. And then, yeah, somehow, which was also like kind of confusing to me, somehow you get data here in the index, for example. You get all the bootcamp somehow. You somehow have this model, and then somehow this ends up in your view. And the view displays to the user. So how, this is mind-blowing, right? Actually, there's no code that indicates that any of that will happen. But yeah, once you know that Rails is an MVC framework and it's like a model view controller framework, and data is basically passed around, like it all starts with the user, right? The user hits your website from, or tries to hit your application from the browser, and it hits the Rails router, and it reads from the routes file, and then it knows by conventions, by naming conventions, that it needs to go to a certain action based on the request and based what you have configured in your routes. Then it goes to the controller. It goes like to the, it has the model available in the controller because of the names. It's always based on the names. And the model gets magically data out of the database and gets it to the controller, and then it gets to the view. And now we have a page for our user, and then it goes back again as HTML to our users. And, you know, this is a lot of stuff. And I don't know in detail how this works either. Like, I have an imagination because I have a few years now in like computer science and in the software development field, but I don't know the details, and some of it still, maybe you sensed it, is kind of a little bit of magic to me. And this is just a sign for me that I need a good tutorial to go through and to rebuild Rails, for example. There are a couple of them actually, and then you will have a really good understanding of how all of this happens. And there is actually one big good thing about all this convention stuff is when you have this kind of thing where it's all magic and it's hard to understand, it's tough, I know. But then when you want to check out like some open source projects, let's say in Ruby, and you have this awesome blog post by this awesome guy here, and you just go down and you want to get really serious about like open source and doing a cool project, a big project, your biggest project maybe, and then you work on a crazy app, I don't know, like GitLab, and it's a huge app. You are crazy to do that, but I also encourage you to take a look after maybe the bootcamp and just try to explore like some of the projects, and you will see that some things are similar, right? Okay, this project has probably I don't know, 800 models or something. It's crazy. But then it also has the controller, and the controller gets hit from the routes file, and you have, I don't know, this unsubscribes controller, and the unsubscribes controller gets some data, so we know there must be a user model, and the user model is actually here. It's a really simply named model. And now we know if we need to fix anything in the view, we probably will have something like something in the views that says users, and even here in its own folder, unsubscribe, show, and somewhere you have the email, which is actually also passed as data as an instance variable here. So if you need to fix something, you know where it is. Kind of, right? So good to have those conventions there. And also good to have ActiveRecord. ActiveRecord is another thing which is actually really insane. Like, it's an ORM. It's basically a wrapper around something. Okay, it's a wrapper of the relational SQL databases that maps data from a SQL database to your cool, that boring data, right? Columns, rows, blah, query language, to your cool objects, your user, your money object, and your bootcamp object, and whatever. And it maps those things and makes them available in your application. And if you need to write this yourself, this is a lot of code. This is not fun. And when you look at an ActiveRecord object, it's just kind of an empty class, right? It doesn't have anything. It's really... This is really magical if you take a look at the console, and then you will see that like bootcamp, if you check it out, it has like instance methods. It's a whole array of things. It has 324 instance methods, and if you just have a class, let's define another class, an empty class. I'm not sure actually if this would define it. Yeah, and then we can see it also has a lot of instance methods, but just 92. So this one has way more instance methods. And okay, this is actually, even as a developer, if you're doing this a little bit longer, this is even less of magic, because this is here an inheritance, and it probably means that something is happening here. And it probably means, oh, this thing inherits from this thing, and basically this has a lot of code. So you end up with all this code, and this code loads way more code, autoload this, autoload that. So you can imagine this is really insane, right? It has 200 more methods, and it all comes from here, and it gives you such awesome functionality, like I don't know, bootcamp first. I don't have data there, but it has a title. The bootcamp has a title. This is nil, so we don't have a title yet, but I hope you know what I mean. And on the one hand, it looks like an empty class and like just pure magic, and it communicates with the database even. On the other hand, if you just saw, there's like a lot of code behind it, or a lot of characters written by someone to make it possible. And actually, if you do a call to a database, you can actually follow it really nicely, how the code is working. You can set up a debugger and then walk through the code, and then you will see, yeah, this is actually code running. It's not like someone spelling a spell or something. Okay, let's take a look. I really want to hear from you later what kind of things you perceive right now as magic. I perceive as magic very different things that I've perceived as magic 4 years ago, which doesn't mean I don't still like to call it magic. Although I know it's bits and bytes and ones and zeros going over wires and signals in the air. Okay, let's take a really quick look at Ruby magic. And understanding Ruby magic is the best way actually to understand Rails. And understanding Ruby and learning Ruby is the best way to understand Rails, because it makes things much easier. And why Ruby is perceived as magical so often is a lot because it's so human friendly. It's designed to be a really human readable language. It's the most human readable language you can just imagine in this world, and the most powerful. Maybe they're more readable but less powerful. There are so many crazy languages out there, so I don't think it's impossible, but Ruby. There are, for example, alias methods. It's a very simple thing actually, and it's not a lot of magic, but when you read code and you see that one thing does exactly the same thing as the other thing, and you don't understand why, and then someday you Google it and you see that this is the same method just with different names, and this is only the thing in Ruby. So if you come from another language, this is pure magic. Black magic. And in Ruby it's possible to have like several names for one thing, and it makes things a little bit more difficult sometimes, but then on the other hand, it makes people also more productive and it allows for more intuitive coding. Another thing, the innumerable thing module in Ruby, it's something that gives you so many methods, so many cool things to do with your objects, with your instances, and it allows to work with arrays so nicely. And it has a lot of methods, right? And some of them, when you see them, you first may think it's magic, but then it's just methods documented in the Ruby docs. So check out the Ruby docs and check out the innumerable method module and read through it, memorize the methods, or at least have a sense for them. Another thing in Ruby, and you shouldn't really dig into it, is like Ruby Golf. And you should really not do it right now. But later I recommend you to dig a little bit into it. It's also could be a little bit fun. But in Ruby you can do so many things in a very short manner. It's quite a verbose language actually, but if you want, you can try to solve challenges, for example, with the least amount of characters that you can come up with. And yeah, I encourage you to do this, but not now. And this is, by the way, this is the Ruby Discord. a guy writing there some stuff. You will see a lot of things like that there, and you should check it out later. And you should definitely check out Ruby communities and Rails communities because they are full of really nice people. And then in Ruby there is this metaprogramming thing, which adds a huge ton of this magic thing to it. And this metaprogramming thing is basically Ruby allows you to do more things on the fly than in other languages. That's the good thing, and for some people the bad thing, and sometimes it leads to too smart of a design, too hidden of features, so to say, that make debugging more difficult, for example. And those things happen really without you knowing. And one good example is, it's maybe not a perfect example for metaprogramming because we don't really define things dynamically on the fly here, but we have a situation like this. It's a simple example, maybe. We have a class, and the class defines methods, and every class inherits from object, and every object inherits from kernel, and everything inherits from basic object. And the basic object has a method missing method. And when you call a method that doesn't exist on your class here, it looks here in object, it doesn't find it as well. It looks in kernel, doesn't find it as well. And then it looks here in basic object, it doesn't find it. And then there is some, magic that calls the method missing. And you get an error, this doesn't exist. And the good and bad thing is you can override this, and it makes some DSLs and some frameworks work really, really well with it, make really nice things with it, overriding it here, so that you call ASDF method here, and you can say, if you have method missing defined here and say puts hi, it will say hi. And it brings a lot of trouble with it, but it works. And it's also a documented thing, right? You can read up on it. So what I want to say here is, today, it's actually not always magic. The whole computer science thing is magic. If I look inside my computer, it's insane. But if you really dig deeper, then you will see that most of the time, or all of the time, things can be explained actually, and it's just most of the time a lack of knowledge probably, and things that seem magical to you now won't in 2 years or in 10 years. And it's an invitation to learn more about the topic. So the question is how do you become a magician, right? How do you bend the magic? And I really want to encourage you to be a lot inside of the console, of the Rails console and of the Ruby IRB console. You will have a great time if you inspect everything, if you take a look at your objects. And there is a free resource that just became free a few days ago, a few pages of just getting you started with it in Rails. It's a really fun resource. I'll give you the slides afterwards, so no need to write everything down now. So writing tests. Yeah, write tests. Tests are awesome. Tests is one of my passions, test-driven development. Write tests if you don't understand something in the app. You can write a test for it. If the test is useless in the end, you can delete it. It's also another way of working inside the console. So basically, when you work inside the console, you also kind of write tests, but you throw them away immediately. You can kind of manifest your tests when you actually manifest your experiments when you actually write them out as tests. Write small programs. I recently got this kind of a tip from someone to do that and to become kind of a proficient programmer, maybe so to say. And there are a lot of books that have the same advice actually. I've read, all of them in more or less detail, and they kind of say write small pieces of software, rewrite them, throw them away, write them again. The same is in painting or something, in drawing or singing. You sing a little bit and then you try something else and sing a little bit more differently. You paint something and you paint it again and again and again until it looks good. Search. If you want to be a developer, you need to become a good search engine on your own. And in Ruby and Rails, it's kind of cool. You have all these cool resources. You have the communities. I can share them with you. Yeah, check this out. This post I wrote some time ago. It has everything basically, apart from blogs and conference talks. There are video resources. If you find a topic that you don't understand, search. I mean, you always will Google for it, but then you can also search across different video platforms to get some videos on it, which is pretty cool. And you can check out conference talks on YouTube about the topic. Or maybe there are also good videos on YouTube, free videos. That's super important. And this is it already. Oh my god. So quickly. Yeah. Thank you very much. Maybe let's go to this website here together and let's reflect together. I don't even remember what kind of reflection feedback form I had here. But if we go here, we will get here and we can give our name. If you have different names, choose one. And have you learned something new? Yes. While doing this talk, I learned a lot of new stuff. And what is Ruby, Rails, ActiveRecord, and Co? It's probably, I mean, in a sense, it's pure magic, but choose your own, please. What was most useful here today? For me, it was just seeing you and getting in touch. Seeing you and getting in touch. Okay, and now you have an invite to a hackathon. You can connect with me on LinkedIn and have some beverage here in Barcelona, and you can have the slides here. So have fun with that. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions.